My name is Bob Blackshaw, and Rob Dunn is just over here, and he's digging up some plants to show you here in a few minutes. So we're going to talk about no-till today, and really our focus will be about some of the good things that have happened since the widespread adoption of no-till. So that's what sort of we're going to be talking about, and I would say that happened in the 1990s. And so we're going to talk about that, what that's meant in terms of our soil health, our soil quality, what it means in terms of crop diversification, what it means in terms of our crop yields, and all the good things that happen. But to sort of back up, I want to set the stage a little bit. You're going to hear a little bit of the same message when you go over and talk to Wayne Linwell and Ben, but I'll sort of give you a very short synopsis of sort of the history of this region and why we went to no-till and how we got there and how long it took. So, the Canadian prairies are a big region. Certainly settlers came in there in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and certainly, that's where some of my family settled at that time. But in this area, it was more like the 1900s, and they were European settlers. Some people came from the U.S., had been in the U.S. and came to Canada to settle. And when they arrived here, a lot of it was grassland. You go further north, there would be some trees, but they had to break the land and plant a crop. And so they used equipment that they were familiar with, and so that meant a lot of tillage. That was the moldboard plow, and maybe discs and stuff like that. And you'll see some of that equipment this afternoon in that demonstration display. And sort of their experience, if they had any experience, they sort of used that. So they came in the early 1900s and started cropping, say if we talk about this region here in southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, and they did quite well. So there was a wet cycle. So we've been in a wet cycle here the last 10 or 12 years, right in the Lethbridge area. There was a very similar cycle like that in the early 1900s, right up until about the end of World War I. So there was good rainfall. They had soil that had just been freshly broken, so it was high in organic matter, high in nitrogen, and they grew some fabulous crops. Wheat was the king crop at that time, and prices were extremely high. So they were getting $1, $1.25 a bushel of wheat. So what would that be today? $35, $40 a bushel. That's what they were getting. So they were making good money, and they were getting phenomenal yields. And they didn't have any disease issues because it was largely a new crop. Rust disease hadn't come in yet. There weren't that many weed issues yet. I mean, sort of life was golden, and it was really, really good. And then we got into more a reality check, I guess, where we went into a drier cycle. And maybe it really wasn't a dry cycle, it was a more normal cycle. And that sort of happened around the end of World War I, or around 1920. Things started falling apart in some of the drier regions. So in those days, they were cropping continuous crop, because we're going to talk about fallow here in a minute, but they were continuous crop and they were growing pretty good yields. So then they get into a dry cycle, and in our windy climate, there started to be a little bit of wind erosion, and there was the concept of fallow was being introduced at that time. And so, not widespread, but it was happening at that time, and so then that became a crop fallow system. And primarily cereals again. So that was wheat. Wheat that they grew as their cash crop to sell, and they grew barley and oats primarily to feed to their cattle, because everything was done by horses, and of course they raised cattle as well, and some dairy cows and things like that. So that's what they grew primarily, and not a lot of other crops. Then we get into the dirty 30s, and we've all heard of that, the Dust Bowl. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And then that drought cycle just became extended again. So then instead of having a couple years of drought, we had almost a decade of drought. And it went all the way down, right from Texas, right up until our region here. And so, it was actually worse than Oklahoma and Kansas, because they had warmer summers, and the water they lost from evaporation was worse than us. So they were actually in a worse situation. But anyway, we had several years where we had, and it wasn't really fallow that was driving this so much, a little bit, but it was mainly we just didn't grow a crop. And so there wasn't any residue to cover the soil, and we had an incredible wind erosion problem. And there's also a couple other things happen. We had a rust epidemic come through in 1 year. We had pretty good rainfall. Wheat stem rust came in and pretty much wiped out the wheat crop in 1 year. Another year, grasshoppers came in, pretty good rainfall year. Grasshoppers came in and ate most of the crop. So there were sort of pest issues that were happening, and the growers of those days didn't have any methods to address those issues the way we do today. So anyway, things became really, really bad in sort of the mid to late 30s. Canadian government stepped in. Lots of people left, abandoned their farms, and the Canadian government stepped in. And one of the first things they did is they said, okay, we're going to take a lot of land out of production. So they took about 7 to 10 million acres out of production, put it into permanent grassland, and that was a community pasture system that was operated by PFRA. So if you know that organization, PFRA became in existence in 1935. And so my great-grandfather in Manitoba was on land that became a community pasture in Manitoba. So I know that story firsthand. So that's the first thing they did, and then they went to Agriculture Canada, existed at that time, and the university systems, and they said, okay, you need to try and devise a different way of farming. And so those organizations went to work. A lot of the work was done here in Lethbridge and in Swift Current, because those were two of the driest areas at the time. And in the brown and dark brown soil zone, that's where our erosion was greater. So it was worse here than it was in Edmonton, for instance, or worse than it was in Winnipeg. So a lot of the work was done here, and they started off by doing some type of less tillage if they could. And you'll see some of that in the display this afternoon. They went into a noble blade in their fallow system, so they tried to keep more residues on the surface. And then they went into trying to not cultivate in the fall, and they had a one-way seeder, so they could, it's the first sort of direct seeding, but it was high disturbance direct seeding because they flipped over the entire soil, but they seeded in the spring. And then we sort of keep going and going and going until we get to a system where we developed the seeding equipment. We had to develop straw choppers and straw spreaders on our combines to spread the straw. We had to learn how to manage weeds, kill weeds if we didn't have tillage to kill our weeds. So a whole bunch of things had to come into play, and that some early farmers were early adopters. That's where we're going to start our starting point for our talk today, and we'll talk about some of the changes at that time. So Rob, do you want to come in and talk about talk today? And we'll talk about some of the changes at that time. So Rob, do you want to come in and talk about sort of some of the moisture use deficiency work here? And then I'm going to talk about some big differences that happen in terms of crop diversification from 1995 until our present day.
Sounds good. Why don't you come in a little bit closer, because there's no hope of seeing the visuals from back there, so don't be shy. Come on in real close here. So one of the opportunities that we had here a few years back was to really, in terms of some of the things that Bob said that, you know, that sort of kicked in the late 80s and early 90s as no-till and crop diversification was coming onto the prairies, was to go in and look at the census and use the census information, use some of the historical information to sort of give us a bit of a picture in terms of, okay, what's happened with water use efficiency over the sort of that 20-year period. In this case, we focused on the 1991 and the 2011 census year. And what we did is we went back in, and so we were able to kind of clip out for an area down in southern Alberta that was in the brown soil zone. We also did that for an area in the dark brown soil zone just northeast of Calgary. The one we're kind of, and that's in your handout that you have. But today, you know, in terms of here this morning, we're just going to focus on the one in the brown soil zone, which is kind of an area that is predominantly dryland cropping agriculture. So it's, and I could just cheat a little bit here, Bob, and I'll just kind of say that, you know, that's what it looked like. You know, that's a chin loam. It's hard to find. It's a rare thing to find an area of chin loam in southern Alberta that hasn't been converted to cultivation. Probably, you know, 125 years ago now. But it was very, very early to go under the plow. Certainly by the, you know, mid to late 20s, most of that land was under cultivation. You know, great land for dryland agriculture. But that's just a little native prairie chunk that is right from the study area, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. But essentially what we did is we went in and again clipped out that census information for an area of about 3 or 4 or 5 townships that has limited irrigation, limited rangeland, predominantly dryland agriculture. And then we did the analysis in terms of what were the crop yields? What were the crop yields for all the different crop types that the census told us that were there in 91 and 2011? and then we modeled the grain production for that area essentially. And then we also went in and looked at the weather records for foremost, which is sort of in the middle of that area, in the brown soil zone. We said, what was the precipitation from 1990 to 92, so a 3-year period. We kind of looked at the crop year, we call it the crop year precipitation. So what was that precipitation that fell from, say, September 1st till the end of August the following year? And then we essentially divided the production that year for that area by, you know, and normalized that across the landscape. So we were able to come up with, you know, a kilograms of grain per millimeter per hectare of production across that landscape. And we looked at that for those 2 periods. And this table summarizes this, and again, it's in your handout, but essentially what we did over that 20-year period with combination of a number of factors, and we'll pose that question back to you, which were some of the really important factors that you think contributed to that really dramatic improvement in water use efficiency. So for cereal crops, we jumped by 29%. So where in 1992 we were producing around 6 kilograms per millimeter, but that jumped to 7.6. For oilseed crops, it was a dramatic jump, you know, from 3.1 up to 5.2, so that's nearly a 70% increase. There were virtually no pulse crops, you know, grown in that area. Basically none reported, and you know, again, very similar in terms of you know, our current level is very similar to what we would get with cereal crops, even, you know, sort of 7 kilograms per millimeter. If we averaged across all of the annual crops, you know, about a 29% increase. If we took across that landscape the annual crops and the fallow, you know, summer fallow, right, was a major portion of that landscape at the time. If we average that across that, we were 3.4 kilograms per millimeter. That's jumped to 6.4, so like a 90% increase in water use efficiency across that landscape. Now, just to kind of point out that the precipitation, fortunate or not, you know, the precipitation was almost identical over that 3 crop year period in 90 to 92 compared to 2010 to 2012, around sort of, you know, 15 to 16 inches. So again, we normalized that across the landscape, but well, give yourselves a pat in the back. You know, if you're a farmer in southern Alberta, if you're advising farmers in southern Alberta, I mean, that's a profound increase where, you know, from the same landscape we're producing virtually almost double the amount of grain that we used to, and that's a water use efficiency improvement. Bob?
So that's sort of, you know, a big success story, and that's what sort of, I guess, to sort of back up and talk a little bit about, you know, why we went to no-till in the first place. But when we got there, then we found out there were so many other good things that happened. And so I'll back up and talk about crop fallow a little bit. I mean, I talked about the Dust Bowl, and everybody thinks that was maybe due to fallow. It really wasn't due to fallow in those days. It was just due to a drought and not being able to grow a crop, and there was no crop residues. But so even after we got rain in the 40s and the 50s, fallow was still an important part of our practice. And so, does everybody know what fallow is? Who can tell me what fallow is? It's a whole year of no crop production, right? So you know, we harvest a crop in September and we don't plant anything until the following April or May. So, you know, we really have 18 months or 20 months. And it was popular in the US and popular here as well. And what was the main reason for fallowing? Risk management. And so what sort of factor, does someone say moisture?
Yeah,
I mean, so it was sort of, we're in an arid environment and we have, you know, rainfall. Some years we have good rainfall, sometimes we don't. This is a way of sort of managing risk a little bit. So how much soil moisture did we conserve over that year of fallow, or 18 months of fallow? Any guesses? 5 inches, 10 inches?
3 inches.
2 inches. So Wayne's going to tell you the whole story in more detail, but the efficiency is very, very low. So he'll tell you 55 millimeters, which is just slightly over 2 inches, so 2 to 3 inches. And really what sort of happened is, you know, during that first spring and summer period, we didn't conserve anything. In fact, we're still losing during our fallow period in July and August, or June, July, and August. And so we conserve some moisture sort of maybe at the end of August, September, October, and a little bit of type, you know, maybe something of snow or whatever. But it was highly inefficient. But it worked a bit. And the other story that people don't talk about a little bit is the nitrogen mineralization story. We had we had soils that had not been cultivated that long. They were still high in organic matter. They fallowed, they did a lot of tillage, and they saved some moisture, but they got a big nitrogen bump as well. So the crop looked better the next year, and it yielded better the next year, and so it wasn't only a moisture story. And so fallow was still very popular, and fallow actually peaked in the 1960s. So it wasn't like it disappeared after the Dust Bowl. It was a very major part of our crop production practice. So it was crop fallow, and we only grew cereals. Again, we're still only growing wheat, barley, oats. We grew a bit of flax, there'd be a little bit of tame mustard. Not a lot of crop diversification that happened. So this is, then we get into our no-till, and a lot of things happen here. So just sort of say, okay, I've sort of already given you the answer, but what was our biggest land use in 1965? Fallow. Biggest land use. It wasn't wheat. It wasn't a canola. It wasn't anything. It wasn't a crop. The biggest land use we had was fallow. So we had 35 million acres of fallow in Western Canada. So we're spending on money on something trying to control weeds. We're losing organic matter. It's bad for the soil, and it's costing us money, and we're not generating any money. So where are we now? On my chart from 1995 to 2013, we say we have a 75% reduction in fallow. Really, today it would be closer to 80 or maybe even an 85% reduction of fallow. So that means, the number one thing that happened here is we now have 25 million acres of land that grows a crop that did not grow a crop. And say even as late as 1995 or 1990. So that's a huge sort of eureka thing in itself in terms of what and crops that we grow in Western Canada. And of course that means a lot to producers, because instead of getting some cash value every second year, they're getting some money every year. And Rob talked about the moisture use deficiency. So when we went to no-till, we found if we didn't till in the fall, we had standing stubble, we trapped the snow so it didn't all blow into the ditches or the fence lines or the trees, melted in the spring, and we weren't drying out the soil in the spring with 3 or 4 cultivations. How much moisture did we save by that? About 2 inches, about the same as the whole fallow thing. So just by not, we could save as much in that system as we did a whole year of fallow. And then we have a more efficient system over time. It takes a while. So then we got into crop production changes, and this shows generally we have a decrease in cereals, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have a big increases in our pulse crops. Here are 200, 300% increases in our pulse crops, and here, and then canola, of course, you all probably know the canola story here, 140, 150% increase in canola. But in many areas, we said it's too dry to grow those crops. We're in a semi-arid environment. All the cereals are more drought tolerant than any of these other crops I just mentioned. We could not grow them. It was too risky. It's risk management, as Ken mentioned, the number one thing, and for all farmers is risk management. They wouldn't go there. But now we're growing these crops, and we're growing field peas and lentil in the dry area like Swift Current or in southern Alberta here as well. So we have crop diversification. So we have a more continuous crop thing, which is good for our soils. And then in terms of crop diversification, we grow different crops. So the value of one crop may be higher than another in 2017, and it may be different in 2018 or 2019. So there's certainly less risk in terms of economics to producers. And then when we talk about pest management, the number one thing you can do in terms of managing insects and diseases and weeds is some type of diversified crop rotation. So that's really helped us as well in terms of our pest management issues as well. So a huge change, really a revolution here that's happened. 25 million acres of crop that we didn't have before, and then we're growing all kinds of crops that we didn't grow before either. And then, I got a footnote here, soybeans coming in, corn's coming in. There's other crops that are coming in a big way, and the more diversification there is, and the more crops we grow, the better off it is. Economics, agronomics, and for farmers in general. So, and Rob didn't mention the picture here, but here, if you look at this picture here in 1992, you'll see these strips are crop fallow strips. So these strips ran north-south for a west wind, and if you sort of had strips of crop alternated with fallow, there was less chance of having widespread erosion because the soil would start to move on that narrow strip of fallow, but then it would hit some stubble or some crop, and then would sort of be caught there. And so that was a very common practice all through the U.S. and then here. So you see all those strips in 1992. He has a picture here in 2010. It's a very different looking picture, right? So it's just sort of disappeared, and that's not that long a period of time, right? So anyway, huge revolution.
When you think about the drivers of this, then, so some things in terms of cereal and oilseed crops, what were some of the drivers there in terms of that increased efficiency? Then it's partly just kind of summarizing what we've been sort of talking about here. So in terms of these two, these are the actual cereal crop, water use efficiencies and oilseed water use efficiencies across that landscape. What do you think the drivers were for these two crops? Genetics, yeah, of course. Anybody remember what canola looked like and what canola fields looked like about 25 years ago? Sure. Yeah. Yes, and for cereals as well, right? And what else? I mean, help me out here. Why did I come to Southern Alberta? It was
the sunshine.
The sunshine, exactly. It was conservation, wasn't it? I mean, so the adoption of no-till. So in this area, we've gone from sort of 10-12% in 1991 to 85-87%.
We have a good retirement community here too.
We have a good retirement community, exactly. Thanks, Ken. So the big one here too, right? Bob's sort of saying, this is the real dramatic improvement across that landscape. It's why you see so many bins in those yards now, and compared to what we used to have, right? And it's that water conservation, and it's the putting that land to work, right? So that's been a huge factor in terms of the reduction of fallow, which we've already covered.
So I think the other thing the producers found is a time management issue as well, and so time means money to lots of people, right? And so if you go out and cultivate it once or twice in the fall, and you came in and cultivated in the spring, and then maybe you had to harrow it to prepare your seed bed, then guys come along and they just go in with a one-pass operation with seeding. All of a sudden, their workload has decreased by a third. So if they were farming 800 acres before, now they can farm virtually 2,400 acres with the same amount of time, right? So there's different drivers for these things. So it all started with wind erosion and soil erosion. Then we got to the point where we could grow a different variety of crops, we could get higher yields, and then they say, hey, I can farm more land with the same amount of equipment or the same amount of people, and it all sort of snowballed into our system today.
You bet. The drivers for no-till, like you say,
Yeah.
Bob, which is a different question as opposed to the water use efficiency, but
Yeah.
absolutely there's been incredible drivers, and I'd like to think it was soil conservation, but no, there were many.
It's like in the
other
other story this morning. I mean, Roger said, did they make a switch because they wanted to be good to the environment to do all this? No, it's driven by economics. So all these things are driven by economics. But if it can be a win-win situation, many things can be. It can be, you can have better economics, and you can also be good for the environment or good for the soil. So
and that in a way it was kind of like it was a bit of a side benefit. So come on in close to the table here and have a kind of a look at some of these soils here. And so these particular soils that are kind of on the front of the table, so this is a fence line contrast from that study area down at Foremost. And so this is again one of those really nice rare chunks of dry mixed prairie that's down there. Right across the fence from that is this is long-term summer fallow with predominantly tillage. You can kind of see this is from a wheat crop here about a month or 5 weeks ago in my travels. This is some land, and so this is land that's been under probably the same sort of thing, 75, 80 years of crop fallow, and it's just been purchased by one of the, we'll say, younger farmers down that area, and he's moved it into no-till 2 years ago, and you can kind of see, the soil has been no-tilled for 2 years, but you can still see sort of the reflection of, in terms of the soil quality. But look what's happened with some of these soils, and this one is probably about 15 years in direct seeding. You can kind of see that, and we see this in terms of the soil quality. Again, it's that first 5 to 10 years as you move into that system. We really then started to see the buildup of residue at the surface, the buildup of a lot more organic carbon near the surface, which is again it's buffering the soil against the elements. It's helping us to retain that water which we needed to grow some of these, big crops down in that area, right? And this particular field is one that I've worked on a lot and done some research on, and we actually did a soil quality study that's as part of the old ASA program and we actually compared the conventional to the native prairie to the and that at that time it was about 10 or 12 years into a no-till program. But again, for all of us, I think it's pretty exciting to see the benefits in terms of soil quality. Moving from kind of a bacterial mediated system of decomposition, where there's sort of minimal soil aggregation, to more of a kind of a fungal mediated. So we talk about the mycorrhiza, we talk about all those beneficial things. In some soils in the US, and I don't know that work's been done up here, they find that up to 25, 30, 35% of the light fraction carbon in the soil is glomalin, which is secreted by mycorrhiza, which gives us that nice aggregation that we see in these soils. And again, this one is right alongside that as well, where the farmer's actually reluctantly invested in cattle the last few years, and he's recently put this into a brome alfalfa. And you start to see that nice aggregation that we get in the soil starting to look a bit more like what we had when we first started. It's going to take us, decades to get back there, of course. But yeah, this is the sort of thing that we, as soils guys, kind of get really, really excited about. And yeah, it's one of the things that we often think about in terms of these systems, and Bob and I wanted to talk a little bit about today, is that we often kind of think about rotations, and we think about its effect on disease and sanitation and having those breaks and all of those things for allowing us to rotate herbicides, allowing us to reduce the inoculum levels for those subsequent crops. We don't often think about what's happening below ground with these crops. So we just wanted to kind of just remind people, when we have a diversity of crop types, we've got that different root architecture, we've got that different soil biology happening below ground that is the black box often that we don't look at or we can't really completely understand. But just to point out, the different root architectures with some of these crops. So we've got our taproot of a canola, right? We have our, this is a faba bean, and this is a Coaldale soil just east of us here, and this is actually land that's been about 15 years in no-till as well. This is a faba bean, and if you've never seen the faba bean root compared to a pea root, it's a nice little taproot on it as well. But again, tremendous aggregation, getting that soil biology working. We have a winter wheat crop. Again, this is longer term no-till. It's got really nice soil quality on that field, but just that fibrous root system of a cereal that we need that in our rotation. So we've got the three. I should have stole one of Ken's corn crops here. It's also a very unique kind of rooting pattern, and in the future, I think the hope is to get some of these warm season crops into the rotation. It's a challenge in our cooler environment, but of course, real benefits.
We're still learning quite a bit about what's happening below the ground, and because we can't see it, it's even harder to study for researchers, and we're still not there yet. I'll be be totally honest with you, but we know there's a lot of beneficial microbes, beneficial fungi in our system, and Rob didn't mention earthworms, but they're very good in terms of recycling nutrients and lots of good things as well. And what we do know is some generalities. What's bad for those organisms that we want in our soil. What's bad? One is they like a continuous sort of crop. They like something growing all the time. So the fallow system was especially bad. What is the second most worst thing for them was tillage. They hate tillage because that will kill earthworms and all these fungal networks that are produced in the soil. It breaks all those networks. So tillage is not good for them. They will come back in a year's time or something like that. It's not forever, but even sort of limited tillage is not good for some of these soil microbes. So I guess I just want to give the message today, just think twice about what tillage you're going to do in your fields, because there's a lot of talk about tillage. You open up the farm magazines, you see a lot of tillage equipment that is advertised for sale these days. So then the other thing that these soil microbes really like is they like crop diversity, because they sort of feed on different things. So wheat will be good for some microbes, maybe peas will be good for another one, and maybe something else will be good for another one. So crop diversity over time is good, and they especially like legume crops, because legume residues, they fix their own nitrogen, they're higher in nitrogen, and then where those roots break down and the residues break down, then that's a really good food source for these soil microbes. So if you can, it's really good to get a legume crop in your rotation every few years. And that can be a pulse like a pea or a lentil we can talk about, or maybe you grow alfalfa every 6 or 7 years, or some other thing, or soybean comes into our system. So getting legumes into our forage legumes or grain legumes into our system is very positive thing in terms of our beneficial microbes, which is just sort of one aspect of soil quality. When we talk about soil quality, it's the organic matter, it's the water holding capacity of the soil, and that's a big part of leading to that water use efficiency is the higher organic matter and absorbing more moisture and keeping that moisture, and then obviously not tilling the land and drying it out. But then these microbes all contribute to our higher crop yields as well. These mycorrhizal associations, they're providing phosphorus to lots of our crops and other nutrients to our crops. So these are all sort of part of the reason why we're getting higher yields. And Rob mentioned, whether it's pesticides or fertilizer we're using on our crops, well, we're getting a good response to those. Some of that's genetics, but some of that's the base higher soil quality that allows us to get a positive response to a higher fertilizer. If we'd done that in an old system, we might put on more fertilizer, we might not get any positive response to that because we didn't have the soil moisture, we didn't have the soil quality. So we all know agronomy is very complicated, biology is very complicated, but you have to have all these systems sort of coming together at one time.
So you kind of see the trajectory here, and so we've got roughly about
15 minutes.
About 15 minutes,
Okay.
somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So the one thing that when Bob and I have talked about this a lot over the 25 years that I've had the pleasure of working with Bob, is this whole thing about, some of the challenges. And so we're, of course, being an Ag Canada researcher, he's forced to think 5, 10, 15 years ahead in terms of, where the industry is headed. And so now we're kind of looking back and seeing the accomplishments that we've had in the last 20 years. And well, we've arrived and now we can just go on in perpetuity and we don't really have to be thinking about any of the challenges that are ahead. And so and didn't people kind of get to that point, the ones that had sort of figured out the crop fallow system and the dust mulch, and if you could just, use a blade and, use some of those things to kind of keep the soil in place, that they'd sort of arrived. But I think people were pushing the envelope and thinking about that. So you think about some of the challenges that we've got ahead, and let's pick on my friend here who's been in no-till for 15 or 20 or 25 years. And what are some of the challenges that stratification? So yeah, some of the things we've been thinking about this last 5 years and thinking, well, what about stratification of nutrients? Because we're not, we used to till the ground, we used to mix everything in, and so it's maybe starting to look a bit more like what our native pasture thing was. Can I just to save a little bit of time, I'll throw in the notion of pH, and what is it that's affecting the pH of our soils that are under this kind of management? We've got that extra moisture, we're managing it more intensively. So what is it that's impacting on our pH in our topsoils in some of the prairie areas?
Residue and fertilizer.
Residue and fertilizer, exactly. So it's the organic acids from the breakdown of all of that organic matter near the surface. And it's also our urea-based or ammonia fertilizers, right? So that's having an effect on the pH, and it will have an effect over time. So, when Bob and I come back with our walkers here in 10 or 15 years,
Next year.
and so like
Motorized.
people will be talking about how over the last few years they was there a need to should we be concerned about those things? Do we need to be thinking and doing some research to say, okay, can we continue through this for the next 10, 40 years with monoculture agriculture, with pouring a lot of ammonia urea-based fertilizers at the system? Are we going to be bringing in some calcium when, of course, everyone's saying, well, we've got calcium down the profile. Wouldn't it be cheaper, Rob, just to bring it up, with a cultivator or something like that? But again, the idea, I think, the message that we've been trying to convey, and Bob says it more eloquently than I, but can we do that with biology? Can we? And I can tell you that just in the last 3 or 4 years on this soil at Foremost, where we said it wasn't possible that earthworms could ever establish in dryland down that area, we're seeing earthworms moving in. And so getting that biology going and sort of cycling these, even in terms of pH and some of these things. But Bob, what do you think about legumes and the importance?
Well,
of nutrition?
I just would add that some deep-rooted crops can absorb nutrients that we may think are stratified at a lower layer or stranded down a lower layer, and they can bring them to the surface. So it doesn't always have to be a tillage solution on some of these things. Some of these deep-rooted crops, a deep-rooted taproot or a perennial that even something like an alfalfa or even like sweet clover that the organic producers use. I mean, those roots go down 4, 5, 6, 7 feet deep, and they're often bringing nutrients more to the soil surface. So there are those types of solutions as well, and maybe we'll go look at the plots here and soon. And
So-
I think there's a question right away before
Yep.
we move, but there are always another way to approach these issues besides going in and ripping up the soil 2 feet deep.
What about compaction and also residue for disease and pathogen load in no-till soils?
Well, the pathogen story is a very interesting one because when we were going down the path of no-till, there was lots of predictions made about what would happen in terms of those things, and 95% of all predictions are wrong. So because we don't know, so one was I'm a weeds guy, so the one was weeds are going to be just terrible if we don't have tillage. And we're going to use like quadruple the amount of pesticide and everything else. And that story didn't really happen. I mean, we have a weed resistance issue, but it's not only driven by that issue. And the other disease one is, we have all the residues on the soil surface. Many of the diseases carry over in the residue, and it's going to be way, way worse. That really hasn't happened either. And I think in theory, it's maybe should have happened. But then you have all these other good things that sort of happen. You have the plants are healthier plants because they have a healthier soil. And we have these good microbes that sort of act as suppressing some of these bad guys. And some of it is simply like an exclusion issue. So, I'm the good guy, you're the bad guy. You want to sit down here? Good luck, man, you got to go through me. And that's exactly what happens with, some of the good things. They occupy a good spot in the soil, and before, if they weren't there, there's sort of a niche that the bad guys go in and proliferate. So none of these issues were as bad as we thought they were going to be, but things adapt over time and change and stuff like that. So
That's why diversity crop rotation is so important too.
absolutely,
You have different varieties.
yeah,
Diversity.
yeah.
And we won't talk about controlled traffic, but there's things that people are considering to try and lighten the load on some of our soil too. One of the radical ideas, and we just wanted to kind of throw it out as a concept, and it's a concept that's been here since the beginning of agriculture, and worldwide it's a,
Yeah,
it's
so
an
let's move
important
over to the
concept. So
plots
have
here.
a
We
look
only
at
got a
some
couple
plots.
minutes to go. Rob wanted to introduce a couple things that may become more popular in the future, may address some of the issues that you've just raised in your questions, and whether there's potential there or not. So the first one is just an intercrop, and it just is just exactly the way it sounds. We're just growing 2 crops instead of 1 in terms of a monoculture. So this is used very widely around the world, where we use manual labor, and you often plant by hand and you harvest by hand, and it works pretty well. In our mechanized agriculture, it doesn't work nearly as well, because you have to try and match up 2 crops that maybe you can plant at the same time, maybe 2 crops that will mature at the same time. Then you have to be able to harvest them, physically be able to harvest them in your combine or whatever. And then maybe you hope you have a different seed size so you can separate out those seeds later on and sell them separately if it's a grain crop. If it's a forage crop, I mean, that's different. We're much more used to growing mixtures. So, I mean, there are some potential benefits here. We know there can be less disease pressure in an intercrop than a monocrop, and sometimes there's less insect pressure, especially if those insects are attracted to a certain color. So if they're attracted to the yellow flowers of a canola field and it's blanket yellow, and we go in here and we've got barley growing with our canola, or we have peas or something like that, it's not going to be quite as attractive as your neighbor's field across the fence. So they're all going to fly over there and eat his canola and not your canola. So there are some of those things that happen. I think, you know, there's some potential for there, but maybe I'm a little bit more positive on this concept over here. And this is just another version of an intercrop. So we call it a relay crop. And what we're doing there is we would grow one crop, and we might grow multiple crops. We might plant them at the same time. In this case, we did. We planted wheat, and then we also planted annual ryegrass and clover. So the idea is here is the ryegrass and the clover just stays an understory in that crop, and then we harvest our wheat, and then we allow them to grow for a couple months, maybe, you know, it depends on our climate, whether we get a couple of months or whether we get 6 weeks of growth afterwards. And so sort of extending the length of time in our growing season. You know, so we're not extending our frost-free period or our growing season, but we're having something growing a greater proportion of that time. And I've already said that for most of our soil microbes and a lot of our soil quality, if we could have something growing all of the time, that's the ideal. And of course, that's not going to happen in our cold winters, but when it's not a winter time, have something growing if you can. So this is maybe a concept. I do think there's potential. All of these things, there's probably more potential if you have livestock into your system, if you have cattle, because you harvest something and then you have some regrowth here. If you have a legume, you get some nitrogen fixation. You have something else, you turn the cattle in and let them eat it, and you get some economic value that way. You might get something if you were going to harvest it as hay, but it would be not as valuable. But if you're just a grain farmer, then maybe you just leave it there. You've got ground cover, you get a little bit of nitrogen fixation, and then you just kill it and you plant your crop in the following year. So I do think there is some potential. In some systems, they would plant a crop, and then they might come back a month later and plant their second or their third crop and plant it between the rows or do some other operation, and have some type of, within the growing season or within the year, they have sort of multiple crops, and that's the term relay crop. You sort of have your one crop, and then you have a second crop that comes along. And so some of these things, they can solve maybe some of the issues. They can help manage some of our pests, I think. Depending on what we grow, we'll look at this one over here, but some of these, we have a deep taproot crop, that can break some of our, address some of our soil compaction issues. We have deep-rooted ones, especially if they grow for more than 1 year, they're going to suck up a lot of nutrients, bring them to the soil surface, and mitigate some of the other issues we're talking about. And of course, the more legume crops we can grow and fix our own nitrogen from the air, I mean, then we're reducing the cost of nitrogen fertilizer, and maybe that whole lowering of soil pH is not quite the same issue as well if we can do more of that. And of course, we're all going to face carbon taxes. I mean, that's the other issue. So we're going to pay. You guys all know that. Get used to it. You're going to pay carbon tax on your nitrogen fertilizer. So it changes the economics of doing some of these things as well. Okay, so we'll go down to the last one here, Rob, and I think we need to point out what some of these crops are down here. Not everybody will know what they are.
So one of the things that we've learned from the organic farmers, really, and this is an approach that has been popularized probably in the US, and when you look at cover crops north of the border versus cover crops south of the border, there's some very, very significant incentives in the US, and it was based on keeping cover on the ground. It's really kickstarted in the last sort of 5 to 7 years. It's kickstarted a lot of work on covers. Here we're just showing by way of example a cover crop situation that typically would be used in organic farmers would be typically using or many of them at least, looking at a multi-species cover that is accomplishing several things. So this is there's a hairy vetch species in here. Bob, I think we dug up, we've got faba beans. We've got the faba bean in here as well. There is a tillage radish. If you've not seen the tillage radish, it's
I just broke the root off, but
there's
that's
one. Yeah, there you go.
that's what it looks like.
There's
So
a tillage
it will
radish
have a
seeded in
deep
the spring.
tap root that is good at breaking soil
How
compaction.
deep, Bob?
Oh, I guess it depends on the time of year that you plant these. So Rob can answer this question better. He was telling them the story yesterday, and so you were telling the group you plant a little bit later, you actually get a bigger root, I guess, and
Yeah.
that's. Well, I'll let you tell the story.
Normally,
so.
as a cover, these would be planted. We put
But you're
sorghum
going to
seed
tell
in.
it quickly.
Okay, we normally this would be planted in mid to late summer as a cover, and then you'd be grazing it kind of in the fall or terminating it, ahead of your next crop in an organic system. So often, and so we're planting it, a little earlier in the window, and then this actually grows a much bigger sort of root. It doesn't want to, stretch out and produce seed when the day length shortens.
Tastes pretty good too.
It tastes pretty good.
Yeah.
So we've got oats, we've got hairy vetch, we've got faba, we've got the radish in there. In this case, the tillage radish, and then the sorghum is the one that you can't find just because of the timing of our seeding. So again, these.
So
are
the idea a
things-
little bit is to have a cereal with a good fibrous root system, and it grows quickly and helps out compete weeds. You maybe have that tillage radish for sort of a compaction sort of thing, and how deep would that radish go? It was
that,
get a couple feet,
yeah,
right?
It's about 1.5 feet.
Yeah, okay, and then you have a legume crop that's maybe going to fix some nitrogen, which is a good story for your soil microbes. And so that's the idea, having these multi-species cover crops where you.
And-
It's just me
So-
for grain.
This one is not. This is just
no,
for
but is that the purpose of this, to be
The-
for grain or for grazing?
grazing. Yeah. So this would be grazing or biomass, right? So they're using it for that purpose. So the relay crop would be a situation. Take the grain and you've got something coming after, right? You're sort of a second crop coming after the 2 grain crops in terms of.
So it'd be grazing, or it would be hay, or potentially silage,
Yeah.
or something like that. So.
So again,
Or you might just turn it down and build soil quality, but not many people really want to do that because there's no cash flow in that given year.
Organic technology.
I'm sorry, guys, we're going to
Yep.
have to cut you off, but please join
absolutely.
me in thanking Rob and Bob